Hello and welcome to this podcast from the BBC World Service. Please let us know what you think and tell other people about us on social media. Podcasts from the BBC World Service are supported by advertising.
What are the most memorable travel adventures? Those where we open our eyes and our minds to new experiences. It's all to see here in Azerbaijan. New flavours, a new appreciation of ancient history, of natural beauty and of rich contrasts. This is a world of culture, cuisine, wellness and adventure, all yours for the taking. Thought you knew Azerbaijan? Take another look. To plan your Azerbaijan adventure, visit azerbaijan.travel.
Hello and welcome to Health Check from the BBC. I'm Claudia Hammond, here to guide you through the latest health news. Later on, are the quick lateral flow tests for COVID, the ones where you get a fast result without it going to a lab, more effective than was first thought? And are all vegan and vegetarian ready-made foods as healthy as they look? We'll get to the bottom of how to work out what's really in that bean burger.
It has certainly become more difficult for a plant-based person to be a healthy vegan, or let's put it another way, it's become much easier to be a very unhealthy vegan.
And should medical students be learning about planetary health? Let me introduce my guest today, Graham Easton, who's a family doctor and Professor of Clinical Communication Skills at Barts and the London Medical School. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks.
Now, we're going to start with a new COVID vaccine because there are still more novel kinds being tested, and trial results have just been announced by the French pharmaceutical company Valneva. Now, they come in a press release before there's a scientific paper, so no one else can scrutinise the data yet, but that is normal. So taken at face value, it looks like good news. So, Graham, how does this new vaccine work?
Yeah, these are really interesting, promising results as well. It's about an exciting new vaccine. It works differently from the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, in that whereas those vaccines rely on a part of the virus, one way or another, to trigger the immune system to respond, this vaccine uses the whole COVID virus, although it's inactivated, so it can't cause disease. So that's a slightly different way, different approach, and more like the traditional approach to making some vaccines like the flu vaccine, for example.
Now, just last week we were discussing the Taiwanese COVID vaccine and how it's difficult to do the usual kind of trial anymore where half the people are injected with a vaccine against a different disease. So they're going to do something called an immunobridging study, and coincidentally, that's what they've done here with this new vaccine. So why do vaccine trials have to be done differently now?
Yeah, because there's COVID circulating in the population, it wouldn't be ethical to do a trial where some people didn't have the vaccine and some people did have the vaccine to test it. So effectively what they do is put two vaccines together head to head, one of which has already been tested and used widely and the other which is the new one. And when they've done that, they've compared it against the AstraZeneca vaccine in this case, they've discovered that actually it has really good results in terms of immune response and creating antibodies in the volunteers compared to AstraZeneca. And even on things that they didn't specifically look for, like cases and severe disease, it does very well.
Now, that all sounds promising, but people may be thinking, well, why do we need another type of vaccine? Isn't the main thing we need more doses of all the ones we've already got so that everyone in the world can get vaccinated?
Absolutely. And there are quite a few vaccines now, and I think that there are a variety of reasons why it might be good. A few examples. One is that because this one is a whole virus vaccine, it's possible that it might be better at dealing with new variants as they arise. We're not sure of that yet, but it might be that they're better than just the ones that use the spike protein. Then there are things like, for example, the way it's stored and the way it can be transported. So some of the vaccines need to be kept at very, very low temperatures, which means that they can't be used in very hot countries or where the storage transfer is not so good. And so this one offers perhaps an easier storage and transfer process.
So what happens next with this Valneva vaccine? The UK cancelled their order of up to 100 million doses recently, but might other countries start using it soon?
That's the hope, and the company is very optimistic that it'll go through the relevant regulatory approval in the UK and Europe, and thereafter they'll be able to start offering it to countries who could really do with it.
Well, thanks for that. Now, there's also been some new research out on how effective COVID tests are. Now, in the pandemic world we live in now, this might feel familiar.
I'm opening up the test, opening up the swab. That was the back of the throat, and now I'm going to put it up my nose. Oh, God, they're horrible.
Yes, we know that feeling, bless you. Well, thanks to that 17-year-old for recording that while he did his regular testing for school. Now, Graham, there are basically two kinds of tests, aren't there? And this was a lateral flow test that this boy was doing.
That's right. So the lateral flow tests are the sort of simple test kits that detect proteins on the surface of the coronavirus taken from a nose or a throat swab. And then if there's enough detected of the surface proteins binding to antibodies fixed to a paper strip, then it may show up as a line on the test strip that we're all familiar with. So that they can happen very quickly. The results come within, say, 30 minutes. But they're very good at detecting when you're in the infectious phase, i.e. when there are lots of virus particles around. On the other hand, the PCR tests, which short for polymerase chain reaction, effectively they are testing for tiny amounts of genetic material of the virus, and they amplify those tiny amounts so that they become detectable. But they can give a positive result for quite a long time after you're infectious, because those tiny amounts that they pick up can stay around for a long time.
And there has been some debate, hasn't there, over whether lateral flow tests are good enough?
There have been, and some of the trials that have been done of it have suggested that they in some of them, really quite poor in terms of how accurate they are picking up disease.
And so a team at University College London have looked at the issue rather differently in a way, focusing on the people most likely to be infectious and asking how many of those people lateral flow tests are picking up. They've just published a paper in the journal Clinical Epidemiology, and Professor Irena Peterson, who led the study, told me why they decided to do something different.
The studies we saw in the early days was a direct comparison between the lateral flow test and the PCR test. And they all suggest that the lateral flow test is not working as well as the PCR test. But that's because they have done a head-to-head comparison using the PCR test as a gold standard. The problem is that if you use a test that continues to test positive for a long time when you are no longer infectious, it may appear that the lateral flow test is less sensitive, but actually it's the other way around, that the PCR test is too sensitive and not just specific to the period where you're infectious.
And there have been studies in various countries, in Denmark, in Spain, the US and the UK. And when it comes to the effectiveness of lateral flow tests, it's often said it's lower and that it seems to range. Well, in some studies it's 36%, in others it's as high as 70%. So it's hard to know what to make of that. But you're using maths in a way to recalculate how effective a lateral flow test is. And what does that mean in practice then? What have you found?
Well, we found that the lateral flow tests are actually much more sensitive than we first thought. So let me give you an example. If we say we have 1,000 people who are testing positive on a PCR test, probably about half of these people may no longer be infectious. So it's only really 500 people who are infectious. And if we compare that to the lateral flow test, where 400 of these people would test positive, it does matter whether we then divide that by the 1,000 people or we divide it by the 500 people. And that's actually what we have demonstrated in our study.
So if you take the 1,000 people, it looks as if you're missing a lot of positive tests. But if you take the 400 people, then you're getting most of the positive tests, but not all of them.
Yeah, exactly. Because when they have done the head-to-head comparison, they have used the 1,000 people and not the 500 people.
But you're saying the other 500 aren't infectious, and so we don't need to know about them in the same way.
Yes, exactly. So we have set up a formula that can illustrate that when you see a relative sensitivity of the lateral flow test of, let's say, 40%, actually the absolute sensitivity should be more than 80%.
So your results suggest that a positive result from a lateral flow test can be trusted. But what about a negative result? Don't those numbers there still miss out some of the people who might be infectious but do have it, who it's not getting? Is it in a way still a rule-in test that can tell you whether you have it, but not necessarily a ruling-out test? If you get a negative, could you still have it?
Well, there is a slight chance, and we do acknowledge that. In the beginning of your infection, you have a very little amount in your body, but within about 24 hours, the virus will have replicated so many times, so you would have millions of copies. But in that small time window, you may not pick up that with a lateral flow test. The lateral flow test will identify those who are most infectious.
So if the tests are not perfect, but they are useful, how best should we be using them in everyday life?
Well, I think many schools are using them, universities and workplaces are using the lateral flow test on a regular basis to monitor if you are infectious, and you can isolate as soon as you get a positive result. So that's one way. But also, I think you should use it if you are a close contact to somebody who have already developed COVID. I would suggest that you continue to test for several days, because it may take some time from you are infected to you become infectious yourself. So I would be cautious about just taking one test.
Irena Peterson. Now, Graham, of course, this paper is about a mathematical model, and the team do acknowledge that it doesn't take account of who's doing the tests. So in the UK, for example, we have free home tests we can do when we like on ourselves. In France, say, you have to go to the nurse to get it done. Is it better if a lateral flow test is done by a professional?
Generally speaking, the evidence is yes. They tend to be more effective at getting enough of the secretions you need to pick up particles of the virus that are required for the test. So yeah, it's we all know how hard this is. Sometimes it can be uncomfortable to stuff
really,
things up your nose. It can make you sneeze like that young man at the beginning. And so I think people are quite often tempted to push it in a certain way, but then to pull out when it becomes uncomfortable, or not twizzle it as many times as the instructions say. And I think that's perfectly understandable. But the danger is, of course, if you don't pick up enough of the secretions or enough of the virus, you might get a false negative test.
So is it a question of trying to do exactly what the instructions say?
It's really important to do your very best, whether it's looking in a mirror to check that you're actually getting it to the right place, whether it's the back of your throat or in the nose, and how far in you need to go, how many times you need to turn it. These aren't just sort of random instructions. They're designed to make sure that you get the best possible chance of picking up samples.
Thanks, Graham, and do stay with us. You're listening to Health Check from the BBC. I'm Claudia Hammond, and my guest today is Dr. Graham Easton. Now, depending on where you live, you might have noticed more and more vegan and vegetarian packaged food products on the supermarket shelves to save people time cooking from scratch. Some of them are even made to look like meat. They're becoming more popular as ethical and environmental reasons mean some people are trying to eat less meat. But could it also be a healthier way of eating? Not always, as it turns out. So we thought we'd find out what to look for when you're buying these so-called ultra-processed products. Giles Yeo is the ideal person to ask. He's an obesity expert at the University of Cambridge in the UK. So first things first, what counts as an ultra-processed food?
Cooking is a process. Fermentation is a process. So, bread is a processed food. Ultra-processed food, however, is foods that have undergone industrial processing, such as we are unable to replicate it in our domestic kitchens at home.
And are you seeing more and more ultra-processed foods that are vegan and vegetarian?
I know so. Because certainly in some countries, such as the UK and North America, and in many countries in Europe, we are looking at more than 50 to 60% of our calories come from ultra-processed foods. And so of those, there are going to be a significant proportion of which are going to be these new ultra-processed vegan and plant-based foods. The problem with ultra-processing is because of the level of processing it's gone to, it doesn't have a lot of protein and it doesn't have a lot of fiber. So these are stripped out. And on top of that, because of the ultra-processing, it lacks flavor. And so you have to replace flavor, which comes from the holy trinity: sugar, salt, and fat. So ultra-processed foods typically are lower in protein and or fiber and high in salt, sugar, and fat. And that inherently is the problem when you eat too much of it.
And I guess that's something we just might not guess at all, particularly if it's something that's a replacement for meat. If it's some kind of vegetarian burger, then you may be associating that with meat and thinking, oh, well, this will be my protein then. But it might not be the case.
It might not be the case. I mean, I think there are certain faux meat burgers that tend to be made of a protein source. I think anything with any beans in it, anything with nuts in it, as long as you can eat nuts, anything with pulses such as peas, for example, these are all very, very high in protein, plant-based protein, but you do have to look at the back of the pack. However, there are a lot of foods like vegan pulled pork. I mean, it's very popular. And these tend to be made of pulled jackfruit, it's a tropical fruit, which has plenty of fiber, but little to no protein. And so you really have to understand what you're eating. Because if you're thinking, I'm going to have my, vegan pulled pork and I'm going to put it on a bun and put a barbecue sauce on it, whatever you're going to do, you're not actually going to have any protein in your meal at all. So you do have to be wary of what you are eating and not imagine just because the title on the box, fills a certain niche that it necessarily has any protein.
And what about those extras that have been added? I mean, sugar and salt and fat, they're all the things that actually make things taste good, aren't they?
They are. That's where flavor comes from. When I go to the supermarket and I try and look at the back of the pack, I don't have my reading glasses with me. It's in font 0. I can barely read it. So you don't actually know how much sugar, salt, and fat. So I think it's the not knowing rather than every single ultra-processed food being necessarily bad.
Of course, we often think of vegetarian foods and vegan foods as being better for us, as being healthier. And there are lots of reasons why people might decide to be vegetarian, and often for ethical reasons or to help the environment. So stay with us, because I think it is time for some cooking.
Just cooking a little food for the kiddies' dinner. A butter bean casserole.
Lorna Stewart is one of our science producer colleagues, and she's a mother of 2 who is a long-time vegetarian.
Burning onions, excuse me 1 second. Okay, let me turn that down. It gets to sort of 5 o'clock and I'm going to pick the girls up and I think, what am I going to make for dinner? Just got to put something on the plate. I definitely think a lot about whether I should be serving them meat and fish much more in order to steer away from some of these other very highly processed foods.
We decided to be very mean and send someone round to vet her freezer.
Yes, Sophie Medlin came round. She's a dietitian and chair of the British Dietetic Association for London. And she was very, very lovely and non-judgmental. And she had a good look at what I've got in the freezer. So, me and my partner are vegetarians, but the kids eat some fish at home. And at nursery they eat some meat as well. So the first thing that I can see resting on the top here, fish fingers.
Fish fingers, staple of most people's diets, I would say. So ultimately, fish isn't an ultra-processed food, and breadcrumbs aren't an ultra-processed food on their own. It's just when all the other things are added in that things become more complicated. Particularly the breadcrumb element can contain lots of additives and lots of things that would be quite highly processed. But ultimately, if you can, the ones that have less ingredients and less additives in them, we're in a better space then.
Okay. I've got a variety of different veggie sausages, corn sausages, things that just say meat-free, pea protein. What do we think about those sort of foods?
So there's a big variety of different things there. And I think when we think about foods like corn, for example, that's mainly made from mushroom-type products. So it's mainly made from fungus. So again, it depends on what's been added and what the additional ingredients are. But actually, it's not necessarily an ultra-processed food on its own. When we get down into things like pea protein and things like that, those very much are nutrients or ingredients that have been extracted from plants and other foods, and that makes them a little bit more processed than perhaps the basic corn products or things like tofu, for example.
But they look really healthy. So on the outside, I can see lots of green packaging that shouts to me, plants. And lots of them, they say, nut burgers with carrot, parsnip, brown rice. I mean, are they any better for you than the meat ones?
It's really difficult to say. It depends on what's been added in there. But ultimately, meat and fish is never going to be a processed food because they are a single ingredient food. So then when we get into trying to replicate them from plant products, we are definitely going to have to process them in order for them to look and feel and taste in any way sort of palatable. So ultimately, it does become more complicated, and these plant-based foods, whilst there's certainly a role for them in lots of people's diets, and if you're trying to cut back on saturated fat, for example, some of them will be much better for you than a standard burger, particularly a more processed burger. But ultimately, yeah, it's difficult to make plant-based foods behave like meat foods.
So am I safer eating things that don't even pretend to be meat? Is it the meat imitation that's the problem?
That certainly is a problem, and the more you're trying to make something imitate something that it's not, the more processing it's going to have to go through. So the simpler things are and the less ingredients things have, the better, certainly.
So, I mean, it's starting to sound like it's very difficult to be a healthy vegan or healthy vegetarian.
I think it's become more difficult as loads more of these products come on the market. I think it's great that they are there. I think everyone should be able to benefit from the convenience without compromising their ethics. But it has certainly become more difficult for a plant-based person to be a healthy vegan, or let's put it another way, it's become much easier to be a very unhealthy vegan.
The reason that I do it is because time is short. You know, I just want to get something on the plate that fills their tummies and is as good for them as possible. I can't honestly say that I'm going to be magicking time out of the air to cook meals from scratch every night.
Thanks to Lorna Stewart there with dietitian Sophie Medlin. Giles is still with me. Now, Sophie said it becomes much easier to become an unhealthy vegan. Can you unpick that a bit for us? I guess it depends what you were eating before.
So if you were a vegan eating lentils and beans, then moving to the ultra-processed vegan foods is going to be, by definition, more unhealthy for you. But if you're a meat eater, like me, and you replace the burger you're going to eat with one of these fancy faux meat burgers, burgers that bleed, by definition ultra-processed, then in some ways it is going to be healthier for you because you're going to remove saturated fats because it's made of plant-based protein. So what are you coming down from? If you're coming down from eating ribs every night or eating lots of burgers and eating lots of meat, then actually ultra-processed vegan foods in relative moderation are going to be healthier than a really heavy meaty diet that you were on previously. An issue is, when you think of ultra-processed foods like burgers, hot dogs, pizzas, you kind of inherently know, I want to eat a little bit less of this because I'm eating a burger. My issue with some of these ultra-processed vegan and vegetarian foods is they have this halo of health, yet it is still a junk food in inverted commas. You know, it is still a fast food, so you need to eat it in moderation. I think we just need to be careful whenever we refer to foods to refer to their nutritional content rather than necessarily blunt statements about what they may or may not be.
Giles Yeo. And next week we'll be hearing what to look for health-wise if you want to drink an alternative to cow's milk. Now, of course, there are lots of environmental reasons for eating less meat and dairy. And before we go, Graham, I want to talk to you about a related topic. Now, this is a suggestion from a doctor in the British Medical Journal that medical students should be learning something extra in their training. And that extra thing is Planetary Health. What is Planetary Health?
It's really exciting, and I'm proud to say the doctor who wrote this article works with us at the medical school. Planetary Health is all about looking after the health of the planet, as it sounds, but there's also a whole area around sustainable healthcare. Healthcare is incredibly wasteful. One example would be to try and recycle a lot of the materials and packaging and devices that we use. An obvious one at the moment, we're using huge amounts of PPE, so a lot of plastic is being used. So how can we recycle that, use it sensibly but safely? So we need to start thinking about where planetary health, looking after the planet, but also how we can provide sustainable healthcare intersect with the health of our patients, where patients maybe could play a role here as well. And it's time, this doctor feels, to actually bring planetary health and sustainable healthcare much more into the curriculum when you're training doctors and nurses. It's been really slow taking off. People have been talking about this for 20 years.
Now, you're someone who does train doctors. Is there an extent to which the medical curriculum is quite packed and you can't keep adding in things forever?
It's so packed. I mean, it's a constant tension and lots of things we like to like to stuff in. Already it's packed. There's a lot more in it than when I trained sort of 30 years ago, that's for sure. But this is one that I think is going to stick because a lot of the emphasis has come from students themselves. This is the generation that's going to be affected by climate change the most. And students are driving this change. They've already done a study looking at how many medical schools are actually tackling this subject. Not great in the UK. Something like only 8 out of the 31 medical schools they looked at had any content related to planetary health, and not much better in the US and Canada either. So I think it's really time to do something about it, and I think it will stick.
And how would learning about it make a difference to what doctors actually do in practice? They give an example that diabetes drugs in the UK take up a quarter of the drugs budget. So you may think, oh, well, that's good then. Family doctors, like you were for years, will try to advise their patients to take action to prevent getting type 2 diabetes. But aren't doctors already trying to do that anyway?
Absolutely, but I think this offers, a new incentive, a new purpose, a new priority, really, to how we practice medicine, but also how we interact with our patients. So, for example, I'm interested in communication skills. If we're teaching medical students about communicating with someone with diabetes, perhaps it could be around, helping them to stick to the medications that have been discussed and recommended rather than causing lots of wastage. Perhaps it might be talking to patients about their travel arrangements, whether they're using cars, which of course pollute the environment, as well as reducing their activity, which might increase their risk of obesity. And so those conversations can start coming in. So there'll be a real dimension always in your mind as a doctor, but also it might leak out into the consultation with patients that, look, there's a chance here also to make an impact on the planet.
Interesting idea. Well, thank you very much to Professor Graham Easton from Barts and the London Medical School for joining us today. Now, there is still time if you'd like me to pose your question to our panel of experts on COVID-19 in my other World Service show, The Evidence. You can ask anything about the pandemic, and we're particularly looking at the spread of misinformation and what to do about it. Do email the